There is a strange paradox in how modern people perceive reality, especially when it comes to the architectural heritage of the past. If we strip away the usual labels and look at the majestic structures of the 19th century with the unbiased eyes of an engineer rather than a historian, a picture emerges that does not fit at all into the official version of civilization's development. We are used to regarding numerous domed buildings with high spires exclusively as religious objects, places for prayer and ritual. However, if we compare their design features with modern industrial facilities, the resemblance becomes so obvious that it is difficult to dismiss as a mere coincidence. The form of these buildings, saturated with complex geometric elements, metal finials, and domes covered with conductive materials like copper or gold, triggers direct associations with technical devices. These are not just decorative choices, but functional schematics. Comparing these ancient temples with modern transformer booths, generators, or wireless data transmission installations, one can notice an identical structural principle. Spires topped with complex metal constructions strikingly resemble antennas and resonators designed to receive and transmit wave signals. Regardless of the denomination the building is ascribed to, whether a Christian cathedral, a Muslim mosque, or another cult structure, the upper part is always executed according to a single technical standard, as if it were a standard project for a power station, adapted to the local style. Why do we so stubbornly refuse to see the technology here? The answer lies in a phenomenon that can be called habit blindness. From early childhood, through school textbooks and public opinion, an unbreakable axiom is implanted in our consciousness. This is a temple. It was built for God. When an idea takes root at a subconscious level, the brain stops critically analyzing incoming visual information. We look at a complex engineering structure, likely capable of accumulating atmospheric electricity, and see only a symbol of faith. If a similar object, studded with spires and metal grids, were shown to a modern person without historical context, for example, on the grounds of a closed factory or a scientific laboratory, the first reaction would be to assume its energy or communication purpose. No one would think it was just decoration. But place the same object in the 1800s and critical thinking shuts down, giving way to learned dogmas. This global misconception is supported by the fact that any deviation from the norm is perceived as an error. History recorded in books is considered the ultimate truth, even if it contradicts physics and logic. We are told that architects of the past spent colossal resources creating complex metal antennas solely for beauty and spiritual awe. And we believe it, ignoring the fact that functionality in architecture is always primary. But if we admit, even for a moment, that these buildings were indeed elements of a global energy grid, a logical question arises about the methods of transmitting this energy. After all, if these giant stations generated or collected electricity, how was it delivered to the consumer? In our familiar picture of the world, electricity is inextricably linked with wires, cables, and poles entangling cities in a web. However, studying urban landscapes of that era, one can discover a surprising detail that completely overturns the idea of the technological order of the past: the absence of the wire infrastructure familiar to us, despite the clear presence of technologies requiring energy. A careful study of the chronology of urban communications reveals a striking anomaly that official historiography prefers to ignore. If we trace the changes in the urban landscape during the 19th century, we can notice a sharp and unnatural transition. The sudden appearance of a huge number of cables and poles that literally shrouded cities in a web after a certain period. Before this moment, according to archival data, the urban environment was surprisingly clean, free of overhanging wires, yet clearly technologically advanced. This contrast suggests that the widespread introduction of wired networks was not an evolutionary leap, but rather a step backward, a forced measure following the loss of a superior technology. This contradiction is particularly evident in the history of public transport. There is irrefutable evidence of tram systems operating without visible sources of traction. Rail vehicles moved through city streets, not pulled by horses and not equipped with steam boilers, which would inevitably produce clouds of smoke and steam. Even more surprisingly, there were no contact networks above these cars, as we are used to seeing today. The version about the use of batteries at that time does not hold water. Batteries of that era would have been so bulky and heavy that they would have taken up half the useful volume of the carriage and required long charging times, making commercial operation impossible. Nevertheless, these vehicles looked light and maneuverable, as if drawing energy directly from space. But then something strange happens. Instead of developing this technology, the world seems to slide into archaism. Horse-drawn trams appear on the streets, primitive carts that animals dragged along rails with difficulty. Later, they are replaced by electric trams, but now tethered to wires. It is hard to imagine that a civilization possessing the secret of wireless motion would voluntarily abandon it in favor of manure on the pavement or expensive infrastructure made of copper and poles. It is more logical to assume that the technology was lost or intentionally withdrawn. This brings us to the concept of atmospheric electricity, energy that was spilled into the ether and available for free at any point where the corresponding resonators, those very domed structures, stood. Likely, the very fact that this energy was free became the reason for its disappearance. At some point, a global paradigm shift in resource management occurred. Wireless electricity cannot be counted. You cannot put a meter on it and send a bill to the consumer. A kind of reset of civilization took place, during which efficient, fuel-free technologies were replaced by primitive but commercially profitable analogs. Coal, oil, and wires allowed for the creation of a system of dependency where every kilowatt has a price. The grandiose stations of the past were disconnected from the ether, their functionality forgotten, and the buildings themselves repurposed. People were told that the antennas were just decoration, and that energy could only be transmitted via cable. Society accepted the new rules of the game, and the memory of the wireless era was erased in just a few generations, leaving only vague questions when looking at old engravings. But if we admit that the technologies of the past surpassed modern ones, the question inevitably arises about the creators of this world. The architecture itself, left to us as a legacy, with its proportions and gigantism, unambiguously hints that it was designed not for a person of the modern physical type, but for someone much more significant. The architectural landscape of the historic centers of most major cities in the world holds silent but irrefutable evidence of the existence of another, more powerful civilization. If we approach the analysis of buildings from the point of view of ergonomics and basic economic feasibility, the parameters of structures from the 18th and 19th centuries cause deep bewilderment. Modern man, with his average height and pragmatic approach to resources, builds differently. We create functional boxes with ceiling heights of 2.5 meters to minimize construction costs and, more importantly, heating costs. Heating excess air volume is an impermissible luxury. However, buildings of the past, which we are used to calling antique or colonial style, completely ignore these principles, as if their creators knew no resource problems or possessed completely different physical parameters. Gigantic entrance groups, doors 4 or 5 meters high, massive handles located at an uncomfortable height for us, and steps that are difficult to climb without losing one's breath. All this indicates that these buildings were not designed for us. They were built by beings of a different scale and for themselves. In these palaces and cathedrals, a modern person feels small and insignificant, like a child wearing a parent's clothes. Huge arched openings and cyclopean columns carry no functional load for people of our height. For us, they are redundant. This forces us to assume that we live in ruins left by a race of giants, or a civilization whose physical capabilities and technologies many times exceeded ours. We merely adapted these majestic halls to our needs, dividing huge halls with partitions into tiny rooms, and covering high ceilings with drywall to keep at least some warmth. Even more striking is the geographic unification of this architecture. It does not matter where the observer is, in St. Petersburg, Paris, Washington, Melbourne, or Buenos Aires, everywhere the same architectural handwriting is visible. The same colonnades, domes, moldings, and layout solutions. This cannot be explained by cultural exchange in the era of horse-drawn transport and sailing ships. Such identity indicates the existence of a single world power, a global empire with centralized construction standards that spanned all continents. Alternative researchers often call this civilization, erased from memory, Tartaria. It was a world without borders in the modern sense, where a single engineering and cultural school erected cities according to one pattern, regardless of climate and remote territories. We behave like new tenants who moved into a house they did not build. We use infrastructure, the principle of which we do not fully understand, and admire craftsmanship we cannot replicate. Official science tries to convince us that all these masterpieces were created by simple workers with chisels and hammers, people who supposedly lived in wooden barracks and died of hunger and disease. But this dissonance between the standard of living of the alleged builders and the level of their creations is too great. Skeptics might object, pointing to archival photographs of the 19th century depicting the construction processes of these grandiose objects. Scaffolding, workers, and construction debris are indeed visible in these shots. However, if one looks closely at the details of exactly what is happening in these frames, confidence in the official version begins to melt rapidly, giving way to a completely different interpretation of events. Upon detailed examination of archival snapshots from the mid to late 19th century, which are officially attributed as stages of the construction of world capitals, a persistent feeling of cognitive dissonance arises. We are told that we are observing a process of creation, the erection of majestic buildings from scratch. However, if we remove the caption under the photo and analyze what is happening from the point of view of logistics and technology, the scenario changes radically. Instead of construction sites, we see large-scale archaeological works. People armed only with pickaxes, shovels, and wooden wheelbarrows swarm in mountains of soil surrounding already finished monumental walls. Their activity resembles an attempt to free structures from earthen captivity, rather than the step-by-step laying of bricks and installation of ceilings. Especially suspicious is the ratio between the grandeur of the architecture and the primitiveness of the tools in the hands of the workers. Against the backdrop of cyclopean arches and columns, weighing tons, figures of people with handcarts look not like creators but like ants inhabiting a hill abandoned by someone else. There is no heavy construction machinery, no cranes capable of lifting blocks to the height of the 10th floor, no concrete mixers. There is only mud, planks, and manual labor. It is impossible to imagine that these same people, having not even elementary mechanization, designed and embodied in stone complex engineering solutions that even today require the use of high technologies. Another proof of the excavation theory is the strange features of the lower levels of buildings in many historical cities. Windows half or completely going underground, doors leading into the soil. All this is written off as the so-called cultural layer. But a cultural layer grows at a rate of a few millimeters a year. It does not bury entire first floors in a single century. Photos of that time often show deep trenches along facades, where workers are literally removing thousands of cubic meters of earth, revealing fully fledged floors to the eye that were previously considered basements. These are not foundations. They are fully fledged living levels with high detail finishing that were buried as a result of some global catastrophe associated with ground movement or mud flows. Furthermore, many frames capture exposed underground communications, huge brick collectors and tunnels running under the streets. Their quality and preservation are astounding. Who had time to lay these complex engineering networks? And when, if the city on the surface, according to the official version, is only just being built? Obviously, these communications existed long before the appearance of people with shovels on the streets. Our ancestors in the 19th century did not create this infrastructure. They discovered it. They were not builders, but restorers and involuntary looters, who cleared the ruins of a great civilization to adapt them for their lives. The cities were already standing there, waiting to be freed from deposits of clay and mud. Official history, unable to explain the nature of the cataclysm that buried the world, preferred to call this process genius construction. But to hide the truth, sometimes one has to invent explanations that contradict not only common sense, but also the laws of physics. And one such example of lies is so egregious that it deserves separate consideration. If the previous arguments could be attempted to be disputed by referring to lost technologies or the special skill of ancestors, there are historical precedents where the official version crashes against dry numbers and elementary mathematics. One of the most revealing examples of such falsification is the history of the famous Grand Hotel International in Barcelona. This building is considered the jewel of the 1888 Universal Exposition, and encyclopedias inform us of its technical characteristics and construction time with unperturbed calm. And this is where the lie lies, the scale of which borders on open mockery of the reader. According to publicly available data, this colossal complex had an area of 5,000 square meters, consisted of 5 floors, and accommodated 600 rooms designed for 2,000 guests. It was a real palace, astounding in its luxury and monumentality. And now, the most incredible part. It is officially stated that this giant was built in just 53 days. Less than 2 months. Think about these numbers. This means that every day, without weekends or breaks, workers had to erect and fully finish turnkey more than 10 rooms, not counting halls, stairwells, the roof, and the foundation. And all this at the end of the 19th century without tower cranes, power tools, ready-mixed concrete, and modern logistics. Anyone who has ever encountered renovation or construction understands the absurdity of this statement. Even with modern technologies, an army of workers, and an unlimited budget, it is impossible to build and commission an object of such scale in 53 days. The process of mortar hardening, plaster and paint drying alone requires time that cannot be compressed. And yet, thousands of tons of building materials had to be delivered by horses, lifted to the upper floors by hand, and communications laid. If we believe historians, Barcelona workers possessed supernatural abilities allowing them to violate the laws of physics and chemistry. Or, which is much more likely, the building was not built in 53 days. It was simply put in order, restored, and painted for the opening of the exhibition. It was already standing there, like many other antique structures. But the cynicism of official history does not end there. To explain why such a masterpiece of architecture has not survived to our days, we are offered a version that is impossible to believe. The hotel was allegedly originally conceived as a temporary structure and was demolished just a year after construction, immediately after the exhibition ended. Imagine the level of expenditure of resources, human labor, and money necessary for the erection of a stone 5-story palace with 600 rooms. And all this for the sake of turning it into a pile of construction debris 12 months later? This is economic suicide that no investor could afford. Temporary buildings are built of wood and plywood, not of stone and brick in the imperial style. Most likely, the demolition was a deliberate destruction of evidence. The building probably contained elements of past technologies that did not fit into the new picture of the world, or its condition after excavation was critical, and maintaining its appearance for a long time was not possible. Historians simply invented a fairy tale about record times and temporary status to close uncomfortable questions. Such inconsistencies are found everywhere. One has only to start checking facts with a calculator in hand. This is an open demonstration that the past was rewritten with broad strokes. However, behind these visible contradictions lies an even deeper layer of information. In closed archives, documents are stored that not only confirm guesses about the substitution of history, but also reveal frightening details of exactly what happened to our world. Putting together the scattered fragments of this mosaic, from strange antennas on cathedral domes to buried floors and impossible construction rates, we inevitably come to a frightening but logical conclusion. All these inconsistencies are not accidental errors of chroniclers or architectural curiosities. These are systemic traces of a global falsification designed to hide the fact of a catastrophic reset of civilization that occurred in the mid-19th century. The world described to us in textbooks is an artificial decoration erected on the ruins of a much more developed and harmonious society. We live in a post-apocalyptic era without even suspecting it, because the memory of the Golden Age was intentionally erased and replaced with a surrogate of dates of wars and revolutions, which only masked the process of dividing the world by new elites. The theory of the 19th century catastrophe explains the sudden technological degradation, when wireless technologies and atmospheric electricity were forgotten, and humanity was forcibly put on the needle of hydrocarbon dependence. But where to look for documentary confirmation if all libraries were purged? The truth, as often happens, did not disappear without a trace. It was securely hidden under the top secret stamp. The intelligence agencies of leading world powers have been accumulating information for decades that is capable of destroying the familiar picture of the universe. Declassified and sometimes leaking into the network, archives of the KGB and other intelligence directorates contain reports that make blood run cold. In these files, reports are stored on archaeological expeditions stumbling upon burials of humanoids of gigantic stature, from 3 meters and above. These finds, which official science calls fakes or genetic failures, are actually the remains of those very builders of majestic antique cities, whose doors and ceilings seemed unjustifiably high to us. There one can also find information about the nature of unidentified flying objects. In the context of the theory of a single ancient civilization, UFOs cease to be ships of aliens from distant space and appear in a new light. Perhaps this is the surviving technology of our predecessors, or observers controlling the current course of the experiment called modern humanity. A special place in these closed archives is occupied by materials concerning the true structure of the Earth. The legendary expeditions of Admiral Richard Byrd to Antarctica and his strange diary entries about lands beyond the ice barrier, where eternal summer reigns, still cause fierce disputes. Secret maps and reports of military pilots hint that the shape and size of our planet may differ radically from the globe that stands in every school classroom. Perhaps we live on a much vaster territory, and the continents known to us are merely a fenced pen, isolated from the big world by an ice wall or an energy dome. All this information has been filtered and concealed for decades to maintain the illusion of an understandable and predictable world. The system does not need people who know about free energy, about their great origin, and about the real scale of the Earth. It needs obedient consumers who believe in resource scarcity and the inevitability of hard labor. However, the dam of lies has cracked. By comparing facts, analyzing architecture, and studying leaks from secret vaults, we are beginning to wake up from a deep, hypnotic sleep. The realization that history has been rewritten is the first step towards gaining freedom. Reality is much more complex, fantastic, and amazing than we were allowed to think, and the keys to this reality are already in our hands. Now that the veil has fallen, there can be no return to former ignorance.